Over the past year, Chief Human Resource Officers, HR Directors have been really catapulted into the driving seat on company boards to make rapid people decisions on challenges that might have in the past taken months or years to agree. And while the pandemic has been a catalyst for this rapid rise of HR and HR teams, in the research that we're going to be discussing today, we see that there's in fact been longer term trends that are having a greater influence on things like people risk within organizations and employee engagement. And so REBA have been delighted to be working with Mercer Marsh Benefits on a major 3-part series looking at transforming engagement. And joining me today, I have Nick McClelland, who is partner and growth leader at Mercer Marsh Benefits. And we're going to be discussing the first report in the series on why the need for change is so urgent for employers, and therefore why this is so urgent for HR. So Nick, I want to come to you with my first question, which is really, what are these agents of change that are colliding and leading to this urgent need to address workplace engagement so differently?
Yeah, thanks, Debbie, and thanks for having me here today. There are so many to consider. Before the pandemic struck, many organizations were, I think, beginning the process of HR transformation. We know now that the pandemic has accelerated both the thinking and practical implementation of new ways of working, but there will be lasting implications if organizations don't consider how to effectively engage employees with the changes for the long term. I would probably specifically call out things like diversity, equity, inclusion, flexibility, and the fluidity in the ways of working, and of course, employee well-being that have taken center stage in the last 12 months. All are significant agents of change and require a new way of thinking on employee engagement. These pressures are also colliding, I guess, at a time when it could be overwhelming for HR and reward professionals due to both internal stakeholder pressure from the board, but also that coupled with societal pressure on how we need to act now as businesses.
Yeah, so picking up on that last point, you talk about how these pressures can feel overwhelming, and I'm sure in your job you see lots of different HR reward benefit people react quite differently to this pressure. So if you think about those who are handling really well, what kind of mindset do you see among those professionals?
Yeah, I think mindset's a great word, Debbie. And the mindset that I see adapting best to the current environment is one of a growth mindset, open to the opportunities and ready to adapt at a moment's notice. And I firmly believe that how a business reacts and behaves in the face of these agents of change could very well mean the difference between thriving and surviving over the coming years. There's an incredible opportunity ahead. And what this pandemic has shown is that we are capable of change at speed to cope with these mounting pressures. But redesigning organizational structure, our continued journey towards digitization, and understanding the links between things like purpose and performance all throw up brilliant opportunity for HR, reward, and benefit professionals to act with speed and alignment to the board agenda at a time when they need to collaborate together most.
So that's a really key point, that aligning with the board agenda. And how are you seeing leaders such as CEOs, CFOs, really shifting their focus to collaborate with the CHROs to address workforce engagement in the face of all these radical changes?
Yeah, I think this is at different levels of maturity in different organizations. And despite the growing industry of automation, of technology, even robotics, at both societal and business level, there is, I think, a growing movement of people first. And if we think about things like business differentiation, innovation, performance, that is going to be driven by humans, not machines. And so I think then things like leading with empathy, focusing on purpose, and engaging your people on that journey means that CEOs, CFOs, CHROs all must collaborate together to ensure the human, the person, the employee, is the first consideration when designing the organization or implementing change at speed in this time.
and change. And with change comes opportunity, but with change also comes risk. And we've seen this rising focus on people risk at board level. Why do you think that is?
It's a relatively new term, I think, for many organizations to get their head around, and this idea of people risk. And I think it boils down to, in a very simple sense, that people are human, and humans are complex individuals. We react emotionally, we make mistakes, and of course, we can become ill, as we've seen very acutely during the pandemic. And that, of course, creates risk for any business, a risk like any other that needs to be managed and thought about in a strategic way. And increasingly, the CHRO, the HR director, has a seat at the top table in the business. And the need for collaboration by the HR and reward teams with their counterparts in areas like risk management, in legal teams, in the finance team, has never been greater. Most organizations are managing risk today. They'll be managing a series of risks in a structured, strategic fashion. And the need to think collaboratively about how organizations positively, strategically add people, humans, employees, to this process is key, given the shifts happening all around us.
And I've been talking to you now with the assumption that change impacts employee engagement, but I'd like to unpack that a little bit more, rather than just the glib assumption phrase. How do you think the agents of change that we've been talking about this morning are impacting employee performance, engagement, and productivity?
It's probably best to think in that way, through sort of a couple of examples, if you like. So I think it's probably easiest to start with the obvious, and to a certain extent that's health and well-being at this moment in time, because it's so acutely in our minds. And I think there are short, medium, and long-term considerations for any organization to better understand the impact of employee well-being and how that impacts on engagement within a business, how that impacts on performance, and how that impacts on things like productivity, which of course have been the famed claims of well-being for quite some time. But now is the time when we really need to understand the impact of that and whether organizations can start to see a positive impact in the near term. And I guess that leads to reaction, because in the short term, I think the temptation for many organizations is to start offering lots of different solutions to employees to help their well-being. However, I think this will likely be costly for many businesses and have little effect. And actually, energy needs to be put into both the strategy, for example, on things like how diversity and inclusion fits the well-being picture, as an example. And indeed, most importantly for me, is just what that engagement from their people is with the strategy itself. And so if organizations wish to see this significant risk managed and indeed turn well-being into a positive business differentiator, then the mud at the wall strategy needs to be replaced with an inclusive strategy underpinned by strong cultural foundations and creating a brilliant employee experience that focuses on health and well-being. The positive impact this can have on productivity and performance could be exponential, but it also needs to be a cornerstone of good people leadership, not just products available to employees. And I think that's key for me. Organizations need to live and breathe this at a cultural level, and indeed all of the change needs to be communicated and engaged the people on the journey with that.
And Nick, you and I have talked over a number of years about the impacts of the digitization of the workforce, of businesses, of organizations. So it's a building shift that's been with us for a long time and really expedited by the pandemic. How are you seeing that digitization affecting employee performance and engagement and productivity?
This is an incredible topic of importance at the moment. Debi, and all of our clients today are talking to us about digitization. And as we saw in the report, this is a core area of focus for the vast majority of businesses today. A consideration for many of our clients at the moment is just how far along the digital journey they are as an organization. And for me, what I'm seeing is a bit of a trend to think about breaking this into two areas. Many organizations will claim to be well on the way to digitization. However, the focus has largely been on improving processes and automation, which, whilst incredibly important in managing the business and of course the risks that we're talking about today, it often leaves the employee's digital experience as a bit of a sideshow. And I think in general terms, the digital experience for an individual is subpar compared to the technology and the digital solutions that we have in our private lives. And this can actually be incredibly, for want of a better word, frustrating. I'd even go as far as to say infuriating for even the more experienced employees who've worked through this workforce digital revolution, workplace digital revolution. And as a result, both engagement with the changes themselves and therefore the impact that can have on productivity and performance is significant. And when considering digitization, I think we need to encourage businesses to think both organizational experience and employee experience when implementing these changes. And it doesn't really matter which agent of change we're talking about. We need to start thinking that way as we head on to this post-pandemic world.
And that's a good point. Perhaps, we've talked relatively big picture up to now in our conversation. So it'd be good to let's get some practical points in now. So what can employers be doing right now to transform employee engagement and reduce people risk?
I mean, there's so many different areas to look at, and all at different stages of maturity for any organization. And I think going through some form of rigorous assessment quite urgently, because this change is happening at speed right now. And it will vary according to where the organization is on that journey, outside factors that often lead to new priorities for any organization, typically led by the board or by the C-suite within a business. And I think there are a couple of key areas we could think about in this kind of rigorous assessment basis and take forward. I would probably call out a couple of specific areas. So one would be benefit and wellbeing design, back to thinking from the ground up, and a couple of key areas within that. I think the first, and it's a word I use quite often, is about relevance. Is the offering today relevant to the stage of maturity you're at as an organization? Typically, I walk into many clients to look at the overall offering, and you can tell it has been designed in a different period of time. And so relevance is really important. The second aspect of this, of course, is then, can we make that experience more personal for employees? That was obviously the original idea of, say, flexible benefits as an example. But I think it's fair to say that even flex itself, whilst offering choice, needs to now evolve to create a more consumer-like experience, a more immediate experience that's personal, because of course that is the experience we get with our buying habits in our private lives today. I think there's then a kind of theme around well-being and diversity and inclusion, which I think is really important. So the mental health agenda is significantly important for any organization to deal with, not just in the crux of this pandemic, but the long-term considerations and long-term impacts are really unknown. So it is a significant risk if we think about it in that sense. And unknown is something that needs to be thought about, considered, and dealt with. And mental health for me has to be at the foundation of how we think about well-being, and again, fitting that into the overall design that we talked about today. Diversity, equity, inclusion. I know, this is a huge topic. It is the biggest topic in the report this year in terms of organizations having to implement the changes they need to as a business to manage this particular area. So again, how does benefit and well-being design factor into that? And then the last thing I would sort of hint at here is getting the balance right with growth. Many organizations are going to look to reshape themselves, restructure themselves for a growth trajectory. And that's a positive thing. It's good for the economy. It's good for everybody as part of that journey. But of course, a balance has to be struck with looking after your people on that journey. And it can't be at the expense of people, as we talked about earlier on, from a kind of people first mentality. We just talked about digitization, but I think just to reemphasize that considering your processes themselves and what you're genuinely trying to achieve with digitization is important. Are you genuinely removing the risk, or are you potentially creating an unnecessary process by implementing multiple digital solutions? It does take that level of thought to consider in that assessment just how far you're going down the track, and sometimes whether you're duplicating effort. And I know I'll think about that in another way shortly. But the digital solutions themselves are also fundamentally about creating automation. And again, a question for me would be: are you managing automation? Or are you simply outsourcing the risk to a third party doing manual processes somewhere else? That's still risk. That's still something that needs to be thought about and managed. And of course, we've just talked about whether the employee experience is up to scratch. And then the only other area I think is really important right now is reskilling. There is a changing talent market. We are in a situation where people can potentially, in many roles, work from anywhere. And that means that recruitment has fewer borders than maybe it has before. And so with new roles to support that change, that provides new opportunity. Do you need to think about your benefit and wellbeing program in context of that change? Because ultimately, that is something that dramatically shifts the workforce around. More generally, this is now the time to review and plan, I would say. The recent report we've produced together, I believe, gives a brilliant framework of topics focusing on these agents of change. And I'd recommend any organization to start or indeed accelerate that review process right now, because now is the time to get your ducks in a row, so to speak.
So it's really interesting listening to you talking about linking that reward benefit strategies to those bigger picture ideas of diversity, digitization, and so on. And one of the things that we often see holds employers back when they're wanting to transform engagement is managing their reward and employee benefits in silos. And so it'd be good to just get your views on how this needs to change so that employers can get that full impact of their pensions, their well-being, their benefit spend, that will really change the dial on engagement and risk.
I mean, it's such a great way of thinking about it, Debbie. I think that silo mentality is there and it's rife. And I think if I was to again think about specific examples, you mentioned diversity, equity, inclusion there. So I think it's a good place to start, because the significant issues that have been brought to life by events, both societally and in the workplace recently with Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, are a significant risk for any organization to understand and plan for. And if I relate that to benefits today, often certain benefits, if we take something like private medical insurance as an example, is often applicable to senior grades within an organization. And as we know, those in senior grades, businesses in the UK and indeed many Western societies today are still predominantly white and male. And as a result, it could be said that private medical insurance is exclusive in not just the seniority context of which it has been likely designed historically, but by default, disproportionately, it excludes more women and ethnic minority groups who make up a significant proportion of lower earning or graded roles. And given the pressures that are actually continuing in the UK to mount on the NHS, as an example, I recently saw a report highlighting that waiting lists are at the longest since 2007, and it's hardly surprising given what's happened this year with the pandemic. There's perhaps never been a more urgent need to consider your health strategy and broader benefit strategy and insurance needs, in particular with diversity, equity, inclusion in mind. And that's just one example of one of these significant engines of change needing to be considered and those silos broken down and having those joined up conversations. And I think in this example, we're seeing the flattening of the traditional organization pyramid. It's not a new concept. Of course, that's been happening for some time, but one that again is likely to accelerate as a result of these changes. And so we need to consider the full benefit suite in the context of this type of change. I'd make one final point on this, Debbie, and this is again based on experience, but too often we do see conversation about benefits very detached from conversations on reward, on pensions, and even well-being. And the time is now for reward and benefit practitioners to get close to the business strategy, close to their colleagues, and join the dots to ensure the benefit program remains relevant and supports the business strategy for the longer term.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. And then looking ahead, Nick, do you think there's a change that HR and reward really need to be prepared for? There's likely to come along due to the way that we're working differently. We've got increased digitization. things that you can see coming down the line that if HR and reward do not get their heads around this, could cause headaches in the future for CEOs, CFOs, CHROs?
There's a lot. And look, it's more important for those who are designing benefit reward strategies in particular to be working closely with the business and their partners externally to be ahead of the curve and manage this change and manage the risk. And I think there's a couple of big topics that that it's worth expanding on slightly. I mentioned earlier about reskilling and maybe even more broadly the approach to talent management within the organization. And if we're to be more borderless than before, then again, we need to think about the connection between how we recognize and reward colleagues. So even going beyond benefits slightly into the recognition space and the rewarding space, who will not be in a traditional local UK office, as an example. And that coupled with diversity, equity, inclusion, both provide real challenge, without a doubt, but also incredible opportunity for those practitioners looking to become a trusted advisor to the C-suite. But I would also say that almost at the simplest level, at the simplest thing, that it's often the simplest things that can have the biggest impact. And all of these agents of change will impact people. Let's not forget that in this conversation. Everything we're going to go through, there is an impact to people. And that's almost the mentality that we need to be thinking about. And therefore, engaging people on this journey is crucial. And I would ask some big questions of organizations today. And this includes my own business and how we think about the changes we're going through. But are we investing enough into the communication strategy to support each strand of change? Are the tools that are available to employees good enough to create regular engagement and actually create a community where people can openly, transparently discuss the changes that are going on? Because that's one surefire way of bringing people on the journey. I would ask that we don't leave our people behind on this journey, that we invest heavily in engagement and communications more broadly to have a real positive impact for our business and for our people, of course.
Great. I see our time is up and there's so much to consider on this topic, but hopefully people watching this video will also download the report and have a read and look through at some of the data and the stats that they can use themselves to help them with their strategies as they move forward. And you and I are going to continue this conversation in the summer when our second report is published, and we'll be picking up on some of these themes that we're going to be diving into more depth than we're currently running a survey on. So looking at responsible reward, the rising importance of having a purpose, the rising importance of ESG values such as environment, and of course inclusivity in the workplace. But for now, I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Nick McClelland of Mercer Marsh Benefits, for joining me to share insights on these vital issues that are keeping CEOs, CFOs, CHROs awake at night. And I really appreciate you and your team working with us at REBA to produce this major research and report series.